The Death Penalty Information Center reported in 2021 that more than half of all prisoners sentenced at that time to death in the United States had been on death row for more than 18 years. The Death Penalty Information Center identified the longest-serving death row inmate as Raymond Giles. He spent more than 45 years on death row in Texas for a 1974 murder. He was never executed because of his mental issues and was finally sentenced to life in prison in 2021. One of the longest-serving death row inmate in Oklahoma was Richard Norman Rojem Jr. He spent 40 years on Oklahoma death row. Richard Norman Rojem Jr. comes from a family with generational dysfunction, and whose parents and caretakers were alcoholics throughout his childhood. Based on mitigating evidence filed in court records in an attempt to explain Rojem's history and spare him from the death penalty. Because Rojem was born prematurely with an orthopedic deformity and disability, he had a painfully dislocated hip, spending the first 3 years of life in a full-body cast. When Rojem was 3 years old, his biological father was killed in a bar fight, and he was raised by his 17-year-old mother in a chaotic and overcrowded household. He lived with 13 people in a 1,500-square-foot, 3-bedroom house. Rojem witnessed domestic abuse between his mother and stepfather and was sexually abused by an older stepbrother. Richard Norman Rojem was genetically predisposed to developing psychological disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder and other personality disorders. Rojem was sentenced to die for the July 7, 1984 kidnapping, rape and murder of 7-year-old Layla Cummings. She was kidnapped from her Elk City apartment. The child's body was found in a field about 20 miles away near Burns Flat, where she was face down in her mother's nightgown. She sustained 3 stab wounds. Layla Dawn Cummings was abducted late July 6 or early July 7 in 1984 from an Elk City apartment, while her mother was at work at a McDonald's restaurant. Photos of the kidnapping scene show her doll atop her bed. Her brother, Jason, then 9, said Rick, was in the apartment at the time she was taken, according to testimony from his 1985 trial. The victim, Layla Dawn Cummings, was his former stepdaughter. She was raped before being fatally stabbed. Rojem, then 26, lived at the time in Burns Flat. He married the victim's mother, Mindy Cummings, while he was in prison in Michigan for sex offenses against 2 teenage girls. Mindy Cummings was the sister of his cellmate. He came to Oklahoma after being paroled in 1982. He and Mindy Cummings had been divorced for about 2 months at the time of the murder. He had been seeking a reconciliation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit did a profile on Rojem and found him to be a psychopath who will not accept responsibility for his actions. Rojem was sent to the penitentiary on July 15, 1985, but has not been under a death sentence the entire time. He was resentenced twice, in 2003 and 2007, after successful appeals. Each time, a jury chose the death penalty as punishment. Investigators placed Rojem at the scene by finding a beer cup with his fingerprint on it within 25 feet of the Cummings apartment on the morning of July 7. Rojem had been at a local bar on the evening of July 6 and didn't leave the business until 11:50 p.m. Rojem called his job around 1:14 a.m. and told the dispatcher to log the time of his call as 12:35 a.m., the court records show. Later Friday morning, Rojem requested that the entry be changed to the correct time. Although the footprints in the soil around Layla's body were not distinguishable, police determined tire tracks in the plowed field were compatible with the tires on Rojem's vehicle. When authorities searched Rojem's bedroom on July 7, they found a used condom in the trash, along with its wrappings, which matched the ones found on the ground near Layla's body. The brand of condoms was sold from a dispenser in the men's restroom at the bar Rojem visited on the evening of July 6. During Rojem's interview with police about his whereabouts, he said he left the bar when it closed, slowly drove to a small supermarket about 25 miles away and arrived at 1:10 a.m. on July 7. He said he then went by his girlfriend's home in Dill City, Oklahoma, before he went back to his house. Richard Norman Rojem was sentenced to death for the killing of Layla Cummings. He has spent decades on death row largely because of those appeals. Also, when he finally exhausted all his appeals in 2017, executions were on hold in Oklahoma. Lethal injections resumed in Oklahoma in 2021. Rojem, who has been on death row for 4 decades, previously had 2 successful appeals and even avoided execution after it had been set for October 5, 2023. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board denied Rojem clemency on June 17, 2024. Rojem previously had luck with appeals, as his first and second death sentences were thrown out in 2001 and 2006 due to issues with the jury in both instances. After serving decades behind bars, Rojem is a Zen Buddhist and is highly respected by his Zen Buddhist friends. Richard Norman Rojem Jr. continues to maintain his innocence, saying at the recent clemency hearing, "I did not murder Layla." He did acknowledge his past sexual assault conviction, which led to him serving 4 years in a Michigan prison for the rape of 2 teenage girls. Layla's mother and Rojem's ex-wife, Mindy Cummings, told the parole board that 40 years is a very long time to see the fulfillment of justice that his horrific crime deserves. She continued, "It's a long time to be concerned about our safety as long as this monster's alive. Death row does not protect us from Rojem." A handcuffed Rojem said during the hearing, "I wasn't a good human being for the first part of my life, and I don't deny that. But I went to prison. I learned my lesson and I left all that behind." The execution was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m. Thursday, June 27, 2024 at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Richard Norman Rojem Jr. has not filed any last-minute requests for stays. After waiting almost 40 years to be executed, convicted child murderer Richard Norman Rojem Jr. had nothing to say. The execution of Richard Norman Rojem Jr. was carried on June 27, 2024. There was no final declaration of innocence. There were no expressions of remorse or regret. On the execution gurney, he mumbled he had no final words. "I've said my goodbyes," he added. At 10:03 a.m., the drugs began flowing in the death chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. At 10:16 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Rojem was executed by lethal injection for murdering his former stepdaughter, Layla Dawn Cummings, in 1984. She was 7. In the death chamber with Rojem was a spiritual advisor, a Buddhist monk from California. Reverend Master Daishin Yalan stood at Rojem's feet under the watch of a guard after the execution began. The advisor and Rojem at least twice spoke to each other before Rojem became unconscious. He was the 13th inmate to be executed since the state resumed capital punishment in October 2021 after a hiatus of more than 6 years. Executions were put on hold in 2015 because of a series of issues with the procedure. The first one after the hiatus was widely described as botched after media witnesses reported the inmate repeatedly convulsed and vomited. Rojem's execution, though, was the latest to be carried out without any visible complications. There were no incidents, issues or problems. In her statement Thursday, June 27, 2024, the mother of the victim also blamed Rojem for the death of Layla's father. "Today, We also honor the memory of Layla and Jason's father, Don Cummings, who is not with us today due to the absolute evil of a monster who purposely tormented him to the brink of despair that ended his life. Don Cummings, the victim's father, committed suicide in Michigan in 1985, writing in a note, "Maybe now I can rest." Rojem had his last meal at 5:48 p.m. Wednesday the 26th of June 2024. He had 2 small Little Caesars, double cheese double pepperoni pizzas, and 2 cups of vanilla ice cream. He also had a bottle of Verner's ginger ale. The Pardon and Parole Board voted 5-0 on June 17, 2024, to deny Rojem clemency. That vote meant Governor Kevin Stitt could not commute his sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Richard Norman Rojem Jr. was 66 years at the time of his execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.